Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most profound medical and, quite frankly, ethical failures in American history. We're looking at the untreated syphilis study at Tuskegee. Our goal here is to examine the historical record completely objectively. We'll be going straight to the source documents, government reports, and the hard data to understand exactly what happened, how it happened, and the massive shadow it still casts over public health today. 40 years. I really want us to pause and just grasp the sheer scale of that number. 40 years. This wasn't a study that slipped through the cracks for a few months. From 1932 all the way to 1972, the U.S. government ran an observational study on human beings, actively denying them a cure for a deadly disease. It's a timeline that stretches across the Great Depression, World War II, the Civil Rights Movement, and literally the moon landing. We have to ask ourselves, how could something like this persist for 4 decades?
1932, origins of the study. To understand the how, we have to go back to the deeply segregated American South of the early 1930s.
Here is our chronological roadmap. We're going to trace this from its inception in 1932 right through the critical turning point in 1943 when penicillin arrived. Then, we'll look at the whistleblowers in the late 60s, the explosive public exposure in 72, and finally, the presidential apology in 1997. Let's walk through this timeline together.
So the Public Health Service teamed up with the Tuskegee Institute and recruited 600 impoverished African-American men from rural Macon County, Alabama. Most of these men were sharecroppers. The breakdown was 399 men who already had late-latent syphilis, and a control group of 201 men who didn't. The official scientific objective? To observe the natural history of untreated syphilis in black men, tracking the disease all the way to autopsy.
Now here is where the deception really begins. There was absolutely no informed consent. These men were told they were getting special free treatment for bad blood, which was just a local catch-all term for everything from anemia to fatigue. But in reality, they were subjected to incredibly painful diagnostic procedures, like spinal taps disguised as medical care. They were given placebos or highly toxic heavy metals. They were never told they actually had syphilis, and they were certainly never offered a cure.
1943, deception and withheld cures. Let's move the timeline forward to the 1940s, right when a literal medical miracle hit the scene.
By 1943, penicillin was widely known as a safe, highly effective, and incredibly fast cure for syphilis. Fast forward to 1947, and it's the absolute standard of care. The U.S. government is actively sponsoring rapid treatment centers across the country to wipe the disease out. And yet, the researchers running the Tuskegee study made the active, documented choice to withhold this life-saving drug. Why? Just so they could keep watching the deadly progression of the disease.
And it gets worse. During World War II, a lot of these men were drafted. When they joined the military, their syphilis was detected, and they were naturally ordered to get treatment. But the Public Health Service stepped in. They handed local draft boards a list of 256 study participants and explicitly demanded that these specific men be excluded from receiving treatment. They literally went out of their way to block these men from getting outside medical help.
To wrap our heads around how anyone could justify this, we have to look at the medical racism of the era. Taliaferro Clark, the founder of the study, wrote this: "The rather low intelligence of the Negro population, depressed economic conditions, contribute to the spread of syphilis, but the prevailing indifference with regards to treatment. Clinical investigators leaned on these blatant prejudices to justify the experiment. They operated on this deeply flawed, racist assumption that these men would never seek or stick to treatment anyway."
1966, the whistleblower. Fast forward to the 1960s. The civil rights movement is in full swing, and a few rare voices inside the system finally start raising alarm bells.
It was a slow build. Back in 1965, Dr. Irwin Schatz read a journal article about the study and wrote a letter protesting it. It was just filed away and ignored. In '68, Bill Jenkins, an African-American statistician at the government, called for it to end in a newsletter. Again, crickets. But the most relentless voice was Peter Buxton. He was a 29-year-old venereal disease investigator in San Francisco. Starting in 1966, he fired off letters to his bosses questioning the morality of the whole thing. They called him down to Atlanta to reprimand him, but he just refused to let it go.
The bureaucratic paper trail here is chilling. Look at these actual meeting notes from a February 1969 ad hoc committee. They convened this panel specifically because Buxton wouldn't stop complaining, and you can see them coldly weighing epidemiological considerations against actually treating the survivors. Even knowing penicillin was right there, they voted to just keep tracking the men until they died.
Buxton was absolutely horrified by this obsession with autopsies. He later talked about his reaction to seeing those internal documents, saying,
I directly compared the work of the CDC in Atlanta and Tuskegee to what the Nazis had done. Realizing his bosses were never going to stop the study, he knew he had to go rogue. He stepped outside the chain of command and took his evidence straight to the press.
If there was any doubt about who was responsible, check out this excerpt from a 1973 advisory panel report. It says, "Throughout the study, the responsibility rested heavily on the shoulders of the investigators to make every effort to apprise the subjects of what could be done for them. Investigators were never in favor of such treatment. The deception came straight from the top. The clinical investigators were the ones actively keeping these men completely in the dark."
1972. Exposure and public fallout. After 40 long years of silent, deadly observation, the truth finally hits the American public.
Peter Buxton handed his files over to an AP reporter named Jean Heller. On July 25, 1972, her story went out on the wire, splashing across front pages nationwide. The public backlash was instant and massive. Senate hearings were called immediately, a new advisory panel was thrown together, and by October, they officially declared the study ethically unjustified. By November 1972, the government finally pulled the plug. 40 years of suffering ended in just a matter of months the second the public found out.
But shutting it down couldn't undo the unimaginable damage. Out of the original 399 infected men, 28 died directly from syphilis. Another 100 died from related complications. And because they were deliberately kept from treatment, 40 of their wives contracted the disease, and 19 children were born with congenital syphilis. We are talking about entire generations of families devastated by a completely preventable illness.
1997. Apologies and ethical reforms. The sheer scale of this exposure forced the entire country to reckon with its medical institutions. The fallout triggered decades of massive overhauls. In 1973, the government was finally forced to mandate medical care for the survivors and their families. A class action lawsuit resulted in a 1974 settlement, right alongside crucial new federal laws. And then, finally, 25 years after the study was shut down, the government issued a formal apology in 1997.
The systemic changes were huge, designed to make sure nothing like this could ever happen again. There was a $10 million out-of-court settlement, mostly going to living participants and the heirs of the deceased. But the biggest shift for modern medicine was the National Research Act of 1974. This created institutional review boards, or IRBs, legally mandated informed consent, and paved the way for the Belmont Report, which is still the foundational rulebook for medical ethics today.
In May 1997, President Bill Clinton invited the aging survivors to the White House for a formal apology. He said, "The legacy of the study at Tuskegee has reached far and deep, in ways that hurt our progress and divide our nation. We cannot be one America when a whole segment of our nation has no trust in America." It was a formal acknowledgement of the deep, institutional scars left behind by the government. The legacy of mistrust. We're going to wrap up by looking at the very real, measurable impact this study still has on healthcare today. The fallout wasn't just emotional, it was completely quantifiable. A paper by the National Bureau of Economic Research found that after the story broke in 1972, the life expectancy for older black men in the U.S. dropped by up to 1.5 years. This plummet was directly tied to a massive spike in medical mistrust. You saw a huge drop in physician visits. Because the medical establishment proved it couldn't be trusted, vulnerable people actively avoided doctors, which led to worse health outcomes and premature deaths that had absolutely nothing to do with syphilis itself. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study isn't just some dark chapter in a history book. It's a foundational event that completely reshaped modern medical ethics and public health dynamics. So, I want to leave you with this provocative thought to reflect on. In the shadow of such a profound betrayal, how do modern medical institutions bridge the gap from simply asking for trust to actually proving their trustworthiness?